Thank you everyone for being here. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Daniele Silvestro here. I will take very brief time for the introduction. He did his PhD in Frankfurt, working on diversification models applied to bromeliads. He then did a few postdocs between Gothenburg and Lausanne, developing further these diversification models. And since 2020, he's assistant professor in Lausanne with an Eccellenza SNF grant. Fribourg, sorry. Fribourg with an Eccellenza grant. And without further ado, Daniele, take it away.
Unmute. Yeah, cool. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Daniele. I'm a computational biologist, and today I'll be talking about models that we developed to understand biodiversity. We are looking at different aspects of biodiversity, from the historical component of how biodiversity originates and evolves over deep time into how biodiversity is doing today. And so we'll be walking through different types of models that we've been developing in our lab, going from the deep past towards the recent, and then trying to say something about future biodiversity as well. To do that, we'll be using computational methods based on probabilistic frameworks and also on deep learning and artificial intelligence. My group works on different aspects of evolution and biodiversity. We develop new models of phenotypic evolution, so models of trait evolution, models of speciation and extinction to understand how species accumulate and go extinct over time. We develop models using AI to track the expansion and changes in biomes over deep time. And we've recently started developing models using AI to measure evolution at molecular level, so from DNA sequence data. But today I would like to talk about models related to biodiversity and estimating its origin and change over time. So this is what I will start with. The first thing is how old is biodiversity, and specifically how old are the big clades that we observe today on Earth. So my background is molecular phylogenetics to some extent, and then I've moved into looking to the fossil record as well more recently. And something really striking when you look at phylogenetic evidence and fossil records is a discrepancy between the age of major clades in the tree of life. These are some examples. The flowering plants are like a highly debated example, but there is like clear discrepancies between the age of the earliest record found in arthropods, for example, and the estimated age of the clade based on phylogenetic analysis. So we wanted to develop a computational method to take the fossil record and interpret it rather than just reading it literally, and try to see if, without making the assumptions that molecular phylogenetic models make, if we could estimate ages for these clades using only the fossil record. And so we developed what we call the Bayesian-Brownian bridge, which is a Bayesian model, so a probabilistic model that uses the modern diversity of species and the temporal distribution of fossil records for a clade to try and predict the time of origin of that clade. This is particularly designed for fossil clades that have, or for clades that have a poor fossil record, like flowering plants, where it is quite unlikely that the earliest record actually represents the very first species belonging to that clade. So this is our data. We have modern diversity and a very incomplete sample of biodiversity through time. And the aim of our model is to try and predict the time of origin of the clade. We do this by simulated conditioned Brownian bridges, which are basically a stochastic random walk going from the modern diversity to the point in time where diversity was 1, that is the first species of the clade. And of course, the data don't really allow us to estimate precisely the trajectory, this diversity trajectory. And so what we do instead is called data augmentation, which is generating very many simulations of what biodiversity could have been. And to do that, and we do this in in a Bayesian framework, and this allows us to generate an estimation of the point where this clade originated. So from running this analysis, what we get is a few parameters describing the volatility, basically, of this diversity trajectory. So here we don't attempt to estimate the diversity trajectory itself, but we do get, as an outcome of this analysis, an estimate for the age of origin of the clade. So we apply this method to a bunch of simulations that I'm not going to bore you with, show that the method works, and then we apply this to a data set of fossil records from flowering plants. We had fossil records for about 200 species, 200 families of flowering plants. And for each of these families, we are able to estimate a predicted time of origin with an uncertainty interval around them. And we can pull together the results from these multiple families and construct a family level diversity trajectory, like a lineage through time plot. And interestingly, what we found is that the fossil record is actually consistently pointing toward an older age of origin for flowering plants compared to just a literal reading of the fossil record. So even though the earliest records of flowering plants in the fossil record are from the early Cretaceous, we actually estimate the most likely time of origin for the clade to be somewhere in the Jurassic. And this is actually very much in line with molecular clock estimates, even though these estimates come from very different underlying data and from completely different underlying assumptions. We've recently extended this model to clades that are also extinct, so you no longer need also the modern diversity, so you can apply this to extinct clades as well. And in this recent paper, we have re-evaluated the age of mammals using this similar approach. Now, this is great. We can use the fossil record to try and get an estimate of a plausible range of ages of origin for these clades. But of course, we are also interested in understanding how biodiversity actually changes over time. So not just when it originates, but what happens to biodiversity after that point of origin. And this brings me to the next project that I would like to talk to you about, where we are developing new frameworks to analyze fossil records and try and predict biodiversity through time. Clearly, estimating whether biodiversity and how biodiversity is changing over deep time is something that has been of interest to evolutionary biologists for a very long time. And it could help us understanding very basic and fundamental questions about evolutionary biology, such as, is there a limit to biodiversity? Does biodiversity increase over time? On what are the mechanisms controlling biodiversity? So answering these questions require us to basically be able to make reliable predictions of biodiversity. The most direct evidence of past biodiversity is the fossil record, which is great, but sadly, the fossil record is very incomplete. And not only is it incomplete, but it's also biased, meaning that we have temporal biases with some periods of time much better sampled than others. We have spatial biases with some regions being much better sampled than others. And we have taxonomic biases. Some clades just fossilize much better than others. In a couple of high-profile papers recently pointed to the fact that the simpler statistical methods that have been used in the past to estimate past biodiversity from the fossil record are actually unable to cope with these different types of biases. And so we've developed a new software that is implementing a deep learning algorithm. So here we're using artificial intelligence essentially to try and solve this problem. And we implemented this in a software called Deep Dive. This software is basically made of two main modules. The first module is a simulator that generates plausible biodiversity scenarios and fossilization patterns. And the second module is where the deep learning model actually tries to take this data and make sense of them. So we have mechanistic models of species diversification based on speciation and extinction rates that can vary over time in multiple ways. We can simulate hundreds of thousands of these clades evolving over time. And then we have a simulator that basically is where we introduce all the possible biases that we know exist in the fossil record. This simulator will take the ground truth, which is this clade evolving over time and space, and will generate a fossil record out of this ground truth. And in doing so, it will introduce temporal biases, spatial biases, and taxonomic biases. So here is where we can put everything that we know about what really may be going on in the fossil record. So here we will end up with sampled biodiversity through time, which is going to be an imperfect representation of the true biodiversity, but we also have the ground truth. We also have the true biodiversity because we simulated it. We can now feed this type of data into a deep learning model. Here we're using bidirectional recurrent neural networks, which are a special architecture of neural networks that allow us to account for the temporal autocorrelation that we expect to observe in biodiversity trajectories. And so we can use this model to predict biodiversity through time. We train our models based on very many simulations that try to encompass as much variation as possible. And then once we have a trained model, we can apply it to real data. We validated our model again with simulations showing that it performs well under different types of biases, taxonomic bias, temporal biases, spatial biases. We have a number of tests that we did to validate this model. And we can then apply to real data. And this is what we did with the proboscideans, so the clade that includes elephants, that has a very rich fossil record, but nevertheless an incomplete one. And you see here in the gray line, we have the sample trajectory, diversity trajectory for the clade. So the clade is quite old. It diversified and reached a diversity that that is almost that is exceeding the modern diversity of elephants. Today, we have 3 species of elephants, and in the fossil record, we in the Pleistocene, we observe up to 20 species of coexisting elephants worldwide. So we know that something must have been going on with the diversity of this group. So we analyze this clade using our deep learning model, and we are able to reconstruct a trajectory, a diversity trajectory with confidence intervals. And you can see that this basically augments what we observed in the fossil record. And there were probably many more elephants that we actually observed in the record. And we also see that there is this massive drop in diversity, which is not entirely surprising, still said, that was recently affecting the clade. So the clade in less than 1 million years, which is a very short amount of time in evolutionary terms, the clade underwent a 10-fold drop in diversity. So we are able to use these models to map biodiversity through time. I guess then the next question will be like, okay, why do we see this pattern? Like, why did elephant diversity crash so badly in recent times? And we cannot answer this question by just looking at a diversity trajectory. To answer this question, we are going to need a mechanistic model where we try and describe the speciation and extinction rates that underlie this diversity trajectory. So here we go back to probabilistic modeling, and we do that using a framework that we've been developing in the lab for years that looks at the fossil record and models preservation rates and speciation and extinction rates in a Bayesian framework. So here we are using the fossil occurrence data and estimating the likelihood of different patterns of preservation, speciation, and extinction. We are currently developing a new model that is based on an unsupervised neural network, where we basically can model changes in speciation and extinction rates through time and among lineages as a function of multiple things. Multiple things being, for example, time itself, so the rates can vary over time. But the rates can also be modulated by traits, for example, body size. They can be modulated by discrete qualitative traits, for example, diet. In the case of the case study that I would like to present here, we looked at the elephants, which we know had this like heterogeneous history of biodiversity, and we selected a few possible features that can be modulating the diversification dynamics. So we had time, we included climate in our model, traits that describe the ecomorphology of these species, and we included whether these species overlap with humans as early humans or modern humans, if they overlap geographically and temporally. So all of these features basically enter into our model, and then we are able to use this neural network to describe how and whether these features actually contribute to explaining variation in speciation and extinction rates. We use a neural network because this allows us to have much more flexibility in the type of response. So we don't assume that these traits are, for example, linearly affecting speciation and extinction rates. A neural network will allow us to have a flexibility in the type of response. As an outcome of this model, we get species-specific and time-specific speciation and extinction rates. So we're able to get an estimate of speciation and extinction rate per species. And then we can use tools from explainable AI, which is a branch of AI research that tries to make sense of these neural network models and try to establish why a neural network is estimating what it's estimating. And so we are able to use explainable AI to determine what are the factors affecting these species-specific, time-specific changes in speciation and extinction rates. What we found is that speciation rates in elephants are mostly modulated by time itself, by ecomorphological traits that describe their diet. And here it's not shown, but also by geography. So island species behave differently from continental species, for example. This is for speciation. In terms of extinction, we found an overwhelming evidence for an effect of humans, which again is not entirely surprising, but humans, all else being equal, increase the extinction rate at least 12-fold for elephants. And this is incorporating possible interactions with climate and other things. So we also found other factors affecting extinction. For example, island species were more prone to extinction on average than continental species, which again makes sense. But even after accounting for all the other factors, including climate and other things and traits, humans still end up being the most predominant factor affecting their extinction risk. So, yeah, so we have now these tools to understand how biodiversity originates, how it evolves over time. We can try to use these probabilistic frameworks to understand what modulates, what may change speciation and extinction rates in the past. And we clearly see whenever we analyze, and we have several cases now that we've looked at, whenever we analyze clays that go all the way to the recent, we found that humans are almost consistently a bad influence basically on biodiversity. That's clear. It's obvious in modern settings where we know that we're affecting biodiversity, but it has been like this for several thousands of years and probably hundreds of thousands of years. So clearly humans had an impact on past biodiversity, but certainly biodiversity is in trouble right now. So there are many more species that thankfully have not gone extinct, but may go extinct in the future. So another branch of, or another research theme that we are pursuing in our lab is to try and use modeling to make sense of the ongoing biodiversity crisis and hopefully do something about it. So we've been developing different tools to predict extinction risks in species and to try to turn this knowledge into guidelines for conservation action. The IUCN Red List is the gold standard for assessing the conservation status of species or the extinction risk of living species. The IUCN Red List basically takes species. You have like experts evaluating the current status of species by evaluating, for example, population dynamics, whether a species in decline or not, evaluating poaching or other threats that the species may be facing, sensitivity to climate change. So the IUCN Red List assessment is a very complex process that takes a wide range of different sources of information and tries to use them to make a prediction for whether species are least concern, meaning that they are doing fine, or all the way to critically endangered. So there is a gradient basically of extinction risks that can be assessed by the Red List. So the Red List is a gold standard, and it has already evaluated many species. So if you're interested in birds or mammals, you will find the assessments for all species. Great. If you're interested, however, in other groups, which are equally beautiful, then we'll see that the IUCN Red List hasn't had time basically to catch up with so much biodiversity. So only about 7% of plants are assessed by the IUCN Red List. 2% or less of the invertebrates are assessed. For fungi, it's like, you know, forget it. There is like 0.4% of species assessed. Meanwhile, there are many other sources of information that could be relevant to understanding whether species are threatened or not. For example, we have online databases that span millions of species, millions and billions of occurrence records out there, for example, in GBIF. We have maps of quantifying or approximating human footprint, land use, so we know where the biggest threats are, how they're distributed geographically. So there is a lot of information out there that has the potential of being predictive for extinction risks. And so we have recently developed an R package. It's called IUCNN. That facilitates basically the gathering of this information and turning this type of information into features that can be used to map, to be mapped basically into a prediction for a species threat. So here we use again deep neural networks to, in species level data that can be, for example, species occurrence data, intersected with human footprint, environmental data. We can use phylogenetic information, traits. All of these things can be fed into a neural network to make a prediction of whether species are threatened or not. We use a supervised learning model, so we need a ground truth, and our ground truth is the IUCN Red List. And then we try to make a model that is able to approximate IUCN Red List classification. So we're not trying to replace the IUCN. Obviously, like ideally, we would have experts evaluating every single species because that's the right thing to do. But at least with these models, we can get an approximation of extinction risks per species. And we have recently applied this framework to a data set of trees. We looked at almost 50,000 species of trees worldwide, for which we could gather occurrence data and other types of data. And using this model, we are able to make predictions for extinction risks across all of these species. So once we have these assessments, we are able to map where the highest risks are found. Somewhat unsurprisingly, we found that Madagascar's tree biodiversity is the most at risk. So with almost 50% of trees being at risk of extinction. This is also due to the fact that Madagascar's flora is extremely special, endemic, and so using these maps, we can highlight places basically where the highest fraction of species or the highest number of species is threatened. We can also look at, we can also break this down by biomes, and we found actually that there are threatened species in all biomes. It's not just something like, you know, for tropical forests. We have endangered species, 3 species right here in temperate environments as well. So every single biome has some threatened species of trees. Now, one thing that we're also interested in as biologists, unlike other implementation of artificial intelligence, is that we don't only want our models to be accurate, we also want to be able, we also want to basically quantify the uncertainty in our predictions. And this is something that like industrial development of AI doesn't necessarily care much about, but as biologists, uncertainty is as important as our point estimates, I think. So we can also use these models to try and evaluate how good the model is, and in which cases are the predictions of this model more or less accurate. For example, here we mapped the prediction accuracy of our model spatially, and we found that there are some areas where our model is not particularly good. And this is really important to know because it could help guiding research efforts. So if we wanted our model to do a better job in Southeast Asia, we would need to have more Southeast Asian species in the red list in the first place, so that our model can be better trained for that portion of biodiversity. So by not only looking at our point estimates, but also looking at the uncertainty associated with our estimates, we are able to hopefully guide priorities for further assessments that can help our model to improve and our predictions then to be more robust. Good. The last topic that I would like to talk to you about today is based on another software that we've been developing in our lab that is called Captain for Conservation Area Prioritization through Artificial Intelligence. And this is using a different type of artificial intelligence, so compared to what I've shown so far. So this is not based on supervised learning, but it's based on reinforcement learning. This is a type of AI that is not as commonly used in biology, but it's very commonly used for other things. For example, self-driving cars or natural language processing. The aim of this software is to help making sense of all this biodiversity data that we have. So species distributions, species extinction risks, threats. Try to take in all of this data and make suggestions for basically where we should prioritize our conservation efforts. And it's doing so by also incorporating the costs that this protection will take. So ideally, we would just be able to protect everything, and then, you know, job done. However, the resources that we can allocate for conservation are limited, and we can't just protect everything. So we need to prioritize, and we need to prioritize mindful of our targets in terms of biodiversity, but also mindful of the resources that we have to do so. And so we implemented this in a software that is using reinforcement learning to try and make sense of a dynamic environment. So here we have a simulated system where we can track thousands of species in a spatial explicit context. And we can track how they change over time as a function of increasing or changing anthropogenic pressure, for example, on the environment. So this is going to be our natural system that is simulated. In parallel, we have an agent, which is basically the AI version of a policymaker that takes in this environment and at every point in time tries to make sense of this environment to make the next decision in terms of conservation priority. Every time the agent makes a decision, the environment will be affected by this decision because now there is a bunch of species that are protected that weren't before, for example. So the environment will be updating after this decision. And so in the next round, in the next time step, the agent will have a slightly different environment to process. And then based on that, it will have to make a new decision. So this is what reinforcement learning is. basically is a framework where the environment, the system is dynamic, and this agent, the AI policymaker, tries to make the best decision out of this variable environment. So the system works by defining an environment in the first place. It can be based on real data or simulated data, where you have species distribution. You can have this for thousands of species. You can have extinction risk labels for these species. You can have phylogenetic information about these species, multiple different things that you can include. You're going to include a budget, which basically defines how much you can protect in the first place. We can have a heterogeneous distribution of costs of protection, land use, and various proxies for anthropogenic pressure on the environment. We can define a conservation target, which basically determines the reward that is applied. So the agent is basically playing a game, right? He's playing the game of protecting nature. And you need to define what the reward is. As in any video game, there will be a positive or a negative reward, whether you do a good action or a bad one. And so the agent will learn from these rewards. And the rewards could be, for example, every time you protect a species that would have otherwise gone to extinction, you get a +1 point. Every time you do something bad because you're wasting your money in conservation actions that are pointless, then you get a negative reward. Every time a species goes extinct, you get a negative reward. So these rewards can be defined based on what we want our policy, like the objective of our policy, what we want it to be. And once this is done, then we start playing the game. So the agent actually starts playing the game. And it will do so by like parsing this environment in a monitoring action, translating this environment using a neural network into an action. For example, selecting this orange area for protection, and then feeding this action back to the environment. So now this area will be protected and it will affect the environment. So our budget will decrease because we spend some money in doing this action. And some species will be protected, some others won't. So the environment will be updated based as a consequence of this action. So now the environment is different. And the next step, the agent will take this new environment and try to figure out, first of all, if the action it took before was meaningful. And to do that, it will get a reward. So the reward will basically give a positive or a negative score to the action that the agent just did. From that, the agent will try to learn whether this was a good move or a bad move. And it will update the parameters of its neural network that translates the environment into an action. And we'll use these new updated parameters to make the next action. The agent will play this game thousands of times before it actually learns the rules. But once it does that, then you have a model that is trained and that can be used for conservation prioritization. So the agent will play the game. The first times he will do a terrible job at protecting biodiversity, but eventually will learn from its mistakes, and it will come up with a configuration of parameters that basically does the best job at interpreting the environment and translating what it finds in the environment into an action. We apply this to an empirical data set of trees of Madagascar, where we have 1,500 species of trees with range maps. We overlay them with some socio-economic and environmental layers, approximating the costs and the threats. And then we ran this data through our pre-trained model, and we identified conservation priorities. So within a given budget and a given objective of our conservation policy, we identified these areas as the ones that will allow us to protect best tree biodiversity in Madagascar. In the paper, we benchmarked this against other software with simulations and with real data, and we found that indeed this AI approach is typically giving better solutions compared to alternatives. So it is worth the computing effort. Now, the very last thing that I would like to talk to you about is an application of this framework within the 30 by 30 agreement. You probably are all aware of this agreement that was signed by over almost 200 countries, I think, last year, where basically countries agreed that by 2030, 30% of Earth will be protected in some form. This is obviously an incredibly ambitious and necessary decision that was taken. But of course, it raises a question, what 30% should we protect, right? And what are the consequences of choosing the 30% in a suboptimal way? So we use our captain approach with simulations to try and address this, to try and see whether different implementations of this 30 by 30 would have significantly different outcomes in terms of biodiversity and costs. So here we simulated data sets starting from empirical data, but here we didn't focus on a particular region, but looked at a range of simulations where we basically had different number and distribution of species with different risks, different costs of conservation, and different levels of or degrees of habitat degradation. And then we applied 4 different implementations of the 30 by 30. So we had different implementations that would end up with 30% of the area being protected. But the selection of this 30% was based on different criteria. The first policy was a minimum cost policy, which we hope no country will try to pursue, but you never know. So a minimum cost policy will basically look for the cheapest 30% to protect. Max biodiversity policy is an implementation of the 30 by 30 where you select the most biodiverse areas for conservation. We use then the MSA, which is the mean species abundance. This is an index of basically intactness of the environment as a metric to select the 30%. And finally, we use our captain optimized AI model to select the 30%. And then we measure the outcomes of these different implementations, looking at different things like how much did the 30% cost? What is the resulting intactness of the environment after we protect these different 30%? How much did we reduce threat using this star index that is commonly used to evaluate the threat to species? How many of the endangered species did we protect with the implementation of our model? So we look at these different outcomes and we compare them using the minimum cost policy as the benchmark. So compared to a minimum cost policy, how much do the other policies change these different outcomes? And this is what I'm showing here. So these are percentage changes compared to a minimum cost policy. Pretty much any policy that is focused on biodiversity will cost more than a minimum cost policy. Not surprising, but something we have to keep in mind. If we want to protect biodiversity with the 30 by 30 implementation, it's not going to be cheap. On the other hand, whichever implementation of the 30 by 30 policy we use, if it is focused on biodiversity, it will achieve a better outcome in terms of biodiversity compared to a minimum cost policy. So a minimum cost policy is the worst thing that you can do for biodiversity. Finally, we also found that using our AI model, the 30% selected under this model will have a better outcome in key metrics. So it will do the best job at reducing threat overall, and it will do by far the best job at protecting the endangered species that are the ones that need protections the most. So using our approach compared to other policies, we are able to find the 30% that will hopefully have the best outcome in terms of preventing species from going extinct. In our preprint, we have a number of other metrics that we measured and a number of other implementations that we compared against these. With this, basically, I would like to close and just to summarize, I presented a number of models that we've been developing in our group where we use probabilistic frameworks, AI, different types of mathematical modeling to understand biodiversity in its kind of long history from its origin through its like evolution over time, and hopefully trying to make sense of the biodiversity crisis that is ongoing right now. That is like the most urgent thing along with climate change that we have to face as humanity. So hopefully this will be useful in some form. At least I hope it was entertaining to some extent. With this, I would like to thank some of my collaborators, my group that contribute to different parts of this talk, funding agencies, and of course you for listening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Daniele, so much for the amazing talk and this overview of all the modeling work that you do, integrating AI with all kinds of other approaches. So I would like to open the floor for questions. I hope there are many.
Thanks a lot for this great talk. I have a question about the captain reinforcement model. Do you have to train it on each individual biome or not?
Not necessarily. For example, like the Madagascar implementation, there was using a model that was trained on simulated data. So it was not trained on Madagascar data. It was trained on basically a fake environment, like a square with like a bunch of species thrown at it. And then the model was still able to outperform like alternative approaches. You can, presumably you would get a slightly better outcome if you fine tune the model specifically for that environment, but it's not strictly necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. This was certainly entertaining. I was thinking about what you mentioned about the uncertainty and how important it is when you're looking, for example, in your case with the UCN and predicting the threat status of species we haven't assessed yet. Have you tried fitting the same approach to a species for which we have threats described for most of the biodiversity, like the tetrapods, and see if it matches what experts have been classifying the species?
Yes. So whenever we train new models, we keep aside part of the data sets, part of the data set that is labeled, so for which we do know the answer, to be able to get a test accuracy of our model. So these are data that the model hasn't seen during the training process, but for which we do know the ground truth. And so we are able to use that as a metric for accuracy. So when I showed the this prediction accuracy, this is based on a test set, basically, on a bunch of species we set aside, we didn't use for training, and then we made predictions on. And so using this data, we're able to identify areas where our model is not particularly accurate.
Could you find something that could predict why the occurrence is low, like some species traits, or I don't know, like abundance?
Possibly. So like, I think there are likely to be some spatial biases in the data that we have. So if you look at the records in GBIF, you will see that there are like many more records in Europe than anywhere else. That's not because there are more plants in Europe, but so certainly these biases will affect our accuracy. There are also maybe in these regions, there are many new species that don't have any records yet, for example. So there are some ways, I think, to at least predict where you can expect to have a better accuracy or not. And it's generally linked to how much training data you have and how good the features that you have are, like occurrence data.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk, really impressive. I'm trying to understand a little bit more how this reinforcement learning works in comparison to traditional approaches. I mean, to me, it sounds like it's a fancy way of optimization but then it works better than previous ways. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit? What are the differences, for example, to an MCMC sampler that I know, I understand, and why is it supposed to work better?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. So reinforcement learning is particularly useful to deal with dynamic environments. So if your action has an impact on your environment, then the next action will depend on your previous action and on its effects on the environment. That's why it's a type of AI that is used for self-driving cars, because like depending on what you see and what you saw before and what you see next, then you will try to make the next decision and like turn this way or that way. So for this type of dynamic environments, I think it's the best that there is out there. Compared to an MCMC, I mean, an MCMC is fine. We use MCMCs all the time, but it's fine if you can define the likelihood basically of your data, which in some cases, like in the case here of conservation prioritization, I mean, I don't think that would be like, there would be even a sensitive way to define a likelihood, because what you're after really is like the decision itself and not, you're trying to maximize this like score that is not necessarily relatable with a likelihood. In other cases, like classification models, then this can be done either using a likelihood or not. So we also have MCMC implementations of Bayesian neural networks for classification and regression. And then they are indeed just like fancy models that you can optimize with an MCMC or with other algorithms. In the case of reinforcement learning, though, it's like the difference is that the underlying data are changing continuously and as a function of the action that is being taken by the model. That answers.
I mean, here you assume the conservation is a dynamic problem. So, you know, you will be penalized when you make an assumption. Now I see you really, you know, what I'm thinking about is, you know, when once a species goes extinct, then you're done. But that's, I guess, then the same as if you would lose the game and then you start over again. Or how does it, I mean, in some sense, you know, so far we always consider this conservation optimization as a static problem. And yeah, so yeah, then I assume you will have to start over again once you reach a score that is too low. Is that how it works?
So at the training phase, that's how it will work. Having the ability to deal with the dynamic system, though, also helps you not only during the training of the process, but also like in terms of implementing this, like because you could include, for example, if you have projections for how species ranges will change due to climate change, for example, or due to changes in land use that you can maybe forecast for the next 50 years. These are kind of information that you can include in this framework. If you don't design your protection statically, like today I decide where every protected area will be for the next 100 years, but if you do this dynamically over time as a, 20-year policy, then you can include these dynamic systems into your decisions, which you couldn't with other frameworks. So the model could learn that protecting this species here is worthless because in 20 years, the species can no longer live here because of climate change, for example. So these are things that you gain from having a dynamic system underlying the optimization.
Great, thanks a lot.
We go to the online questions a moment, and then we come back to the in-presence audience. So we have Chiara Bortoluzzi asking, I wonder if Daniele is considering adding other metrics coming from the field of genetics to better predict species extinction risks.
Yeah, good question. So in the current implementation of our models, we don't really have genetic diversity, but or we have genetic diversity, but we don't model genetic dynamics. But we do plan for the future to use some of these deep learning models to predict population dynamics from a genetic point of view. So using genomic data to make predictions for population dynamics. And that's something that I hope to develop in the future. And it will be based on deep learning models of molecular evolution, like to estimate effective population sizes and how they may change over time. But yeah, that's certainly something very relevant here.
Okay, so we have Thomas Keggin asking, hello, super interesting approaches. Captain model question. Are you including different management policies in the protection schemes? Not all protected areas are protected the same. And he also has a follow-up. Do you take into account things like habitat fragmentation when the agent decides on areas to protect?
Yeah, good point. So the level of protection of protected areas can be defined basically in our settings. So you can decide how much protected a protected area is. And this, for example, could reflect different practices, I guess, applied by different countries or in different regions. So there are many, unfortunately, many paper parks out there of like protected areas that exist only on paper. So these type of settings can be incorporated into our model. Basically, you can define the level of protection that conservation will achieve. About fragmentation, so fragmentation will, because we have this dynamic system where species reproduce, die, disperse dynamically over time and space, fragmentation could lead species to become more prone to extinction just due to stochasticity in the system. So in principle, the model can learn that you don't want to oversplit geographic ranges. It's not something we have explored thoroughly though. Yeah.
Okay, we take one more from online, then we come back to the in-presence audience. So Leonardo Capitani asks, how do you account for confounding among predictors, climate, time, human presence, etc., when you are doing inference on species extinction rate or species diversity? And then he also asks, since there are different phylogenes trees that explain the same evolution process, how do you choose which phylogenetic tree is the best to use as a predictor in your inference analysis?
So I'm not sure if that's related to past biodiversity or extinction risks, maybe. But I can try to answer to both. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So for like confounding factors are a problem in trying to understand the disentangled causes of changes in extinction rates. For example, when we looked at this elephant fossil record, we had different factors that may be correlated to one another. For example, humans also happen to be in a period of time where there is global cooling. So by incorporating these variables, even if they may be correlated to one another, we allow the model to account for both. And then if the model is really unable to pick one feature over the other, then these two features will basically get a similar score. This is not what we found for the elephants, where we found that humans are clearly much more of a strong impact on extinction compared to climate. But in the case of like highly correlated or collinear variables, what you would end up with is like uncertainty between the predictors. I forgot what the second part of the question was.
When there are different phylogenetic trees, how you choose the best one to use as a predictor in your inference?
I'm not sure. I think I would probably look at the support of the trees, or like whether there is one tree that is better than the other, or maybe run like over multiple trees to account for phylogenetic uncertainty.
That is a whole branch of phylogenetics, like it's a whole another talk basically. A very brief question before I come back to Victor's question. Can you please suggest, Liang Zi asks, can you please suggest what metrics would be directed or informed to policymakers to let them know the performance of the protection actions?
Yeah, I think conservation goals is too complicated to be summarized into a single index. I know that like policymakers and in general, we all like indices, but like biodiversity is a really complex thing. And I don't think there is any single one metric that captures everything that we want to protect when we protect biodiversity. Because biodiversity is so many things. It's like intact ecosystems, is species richness, is functional diversity, genetic diversity, so many things. So what we try to do with this captain approach is to get priorities that are not linked to a specific metric, but to a broader processing of multiple aspects of biodiversity, which looks at like species complementarity, potentially traits, species values, like different things. So these priorities can be interpreted as a index, but there isn't like a simple way to calculate this index, unlike for other metrics like species richness or MSA or these other metrics. So this index, these priority levels can only be inferred by using this more complex machinery. So I think we have to accept the fact that biodiversity is complex and that we are unlikely to find the single best index that captures it all. So we are going to have to rely on multiple metrics and maybe more complex models than just things that can be computed easily for any given plot of biodiversity.
Thanks. Victor, finally, it's your time.
Thanks a lot for the talk. It was super interesting. Actually, we've tried to use Pyrate with a colleague, and I'm now very excited to use the new deep neural network-based software. Anyways, so yeah, everything super interesting from the inference of time to like prioritization perspective. Now I'm wondering. So to me, I guess from your talk, I find like the biggest flaw in all those approaches are related to the simulation model that you use, because basically if you don't confront this model to data, then although your neural network will perfectly learn the underlying mechanisms, etc., doesn't mean that it's actually learned mechanisms that are happening in nature and possibly, for example, biological responses that we may not yet observe in nature. So that's my take. But what's actually the biggest flaw that you think is with this AI approach?
Yes, so especially for macroevolutionary dynamics, where we look at evolution that took place over millions of years, certainly the main limitation is that we don't have a ground truth. Whereas for like predicting current extinction risks, we can check if our model is doing good or not, like by just looking at the species that have been already assessed or taking data for other species and do the assessments ourselves. For deep time evolutionary processes, we don't have a way to ground truth our estimations, just because we cannot experimentally reproduce macroevolution unless we are just looking at very fast evolving taxa like bacteria. But for most organisms, experimental macroevolution doesn't exist. So we don't have a ground truth and we have to rely on models. Now, our models can be of a probabilistic nature, where we try to encode everything that we know about the evolution of things, for example, into a likelihood framework. This is what we do when we build phylogenetic methods, for example. We define how we think nucleotides evolve over time, how they're inherited at speciation events, at the branching events of the tree. We encode these into a likelihood, and then we take our data, analyze them under this likelihood, and get a hypothesis, which is a phylogenetic tree. This is the typical unsupervised approach to macroevolution. The approach that we are taking for some of our projects, like this estimation of biodiversity through time, is turning things around a little bit, but it's not that different after all. What we do is we encode our knowledge or our hypotheses about biodiversity, fossil preservation, and so on. Instead of encoding them into a likelihood function, we encode them into a simulation. And then we use this simulation to train a model that makes predictions. So conceptually, it's not very different, because the way you validate a likelihood approach, which is, for example, the way you would validate if a phylogenetic model works at estimating correctly the tree, is not by looking at a ground truth phylogeny, because you don't have that. So what you will do typically is you simulate an alignment under a known tree, and then you analyze the alignment and see if you can recover the tree. So you will have this level of circularity even in a likelihood approach. And this is how we validate all our models, probabilistic or not, basically in macroevolution, where we lack a ground truth and we need to rely on what we think makes sense. So,
yeah, but then somehow you could use this probabilistic framework to somehow tune, I mean, maybe you did that actually, to tune the simulation model that you will then use to train your neural network. I mean, to me, this seems like a more, yeah, like probably the best you can do actually. If you want to really make sure that your, like the simulation model actually captures correctly the mechanism, like or best captures the mechanisms we observe with data.
Yes, so then one way to assess whether your model, for example, your AI model is overfitting or not, will be to compare its predictions with predictions that you can get from a probabilistic framework, if the probabilistic framework exists for that. So for example, we have this project where we estimate parameters of molecular evolution from alignments of nucleotide data. And we were able to compare our AI approach with the likelihood approach and then see if, how they compare. And under which cases we get overfitting on one side or underfitting on the other. So these are approaches to try and deal with that. The fact remains that we don't have a ground truth. So whether you use likelihood or deep learning, you still don't know. I mean, you have to rely on your understanding of the evolutionary mechanisms to decide if your model is doing a good job or not. If that answers.
May I ask a last question? Yeah. Okay, it's a very short question, but answer may be long. So what's your vision of this? Where you want to take this? In the 5 years to come.
I think there is. I think the future will be in this field will be to accept that AI is very powerful, but also the fact that it doesn't do everything that we need. So I think there is at least the research path that I would like to pursue is something where we do basically semi-supervised learning, where we create models that for some things we'll use AI and for others we use probabilistic approaches. For example, you can have a phylogenetic model where you use AI to estimate efficiently some of the parameters of like molecular evolution, and then probabilistic frameworks to estimate the phylogenetic tree. So I think like some level of semi-supervised learning or like mixed inference between that is using the best basically that we get from AI and from likelihood frameworks. I think that would be like a good way to go. Yeah, thanks. All right, thank you all.
Thank you for joining. And if you have more questions, you're welcome to join us for lunch. Daniele has some time after for meeting if people are interested as well. So thank you all for coming and see you next week.